Thank you, Julianne. Welcome to the last session of ILR's course, Confronting Modern Humanism in Jewish Thought. And we've had the privilege over 6 sessions to have as our presenter, Professor Yossi Turner, who's come all the way from Israel to talk to us about a subject that is quite important and insightful, and where we could hardly find anything about it elsewhere. So we really appreciate his contribution. He's Professor Emeritus of Jewish Thought at the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, and he's in his last days as visiting professor at UF Jewish Studies Center. Thank you so much. And today we're going to talk about Moses Hess.
Thanks a lot, Rick. Everybody can hear it, I imagine. The mic, not so much? Is there any way of turning the volume? I'll just keep it closer to my mouth, I guess. Okay.
Is that better, everyone?
It's fine. Sounds good now, right? Okay. So just remember that the last 2 sessions of what we've been doing has to do, we'll call it with modern Jewish socialist interpretations of the Sabbath. You can also call them modern humanist interpretations of the Sabbath. Last week, we talked about this, the interpretation of the Sabbath by Rabbi Nachman, I'm sorry, not Rabbi, Nachman Krochmal. Sometimes my mouth talks faster than my mind. Nachman Krochmal we had visited earlier. This last week was Nachman Sirkin. And so I apologize for that. And we were talking about Nachman Sirkin's essay concerning the Sabbath. And in that context, I gave a short preview of the connection that can already be found in the biblical idea of the Sabbath and the prophetic understanding of divine will on the one hand, and values that we associate with modern humanism. Here it's more in the socialist context in the modern period. When I talked about the Sabbath to show how it's almost, or even more than almost, it's almost a, how would I call it? An expected connection, even if you don't mention contemporary or modern perceptions of social justice or modern socialism, when you read the biblical texts concerning the Bible, you realize that it's actually talking to issues and questions of value that organizations, movements interested in modern humanism, social justice, and of course socialism in this context would talk about. For instance, we saw when we started Sirkin last week for this reason, I gave, I don't remember, I think it was even a couple of texts. I don't remember anymore, but at least we talked about different texts, biblical texts, in which the Sabbath appears. And just as an example, we talked about the 3 types of Sabbath that the Bible talks about, right? There's the Sabbath in the Jewish calendar that comes once every 7 days, right? As the memory of the creation of the world, but that in the Bible itself is already established in memory of the Exodus from Egypt, which means emancipation from slavery. And then, so that's the weekly Sabbath. But then we also have another Sabbath that is in not a 7-day cycle, but a 7-year cycle, the sabbatical year, in which everybody's ordered to leave the fruits that fall from their trees and even what's on the trees not to take, to leave. They have to leave them for the poor people. And in this 7-year cycle Sabbath, and if we could talk also about the last Sabbath, the Jubilee year that comes after 7 cycles of 7-year Sabbaths. And both of these together, I just don't want to spend time, so I'm throwing both of these together include the freeing of slaves in the discussion of what this Sabbath is, what it's for, right? Things that can be connected once again with the idea of the Exodus from Egypt, emancipation from slavery. And the reasons that are given right? Why you have to let everybody, both workers and slaves and everybody has to you have to let them rest on the Sabbath because you were slaves in Egypt. In the sabbatical year, once again, all debts are canceled. The poor people who wind up in debt and just can't pay them get a new start. People who sold their lands because of poverty. People who sold themselves or their children into slavery so as not to die of starvation because of poverty. Also, they're freed, and in the Jubilee year, they sound the trumpet it actually symbolizes almost like the redemption has come and also a return to the Garden of Eden. On the Day of Atonement, a trumpet is sounded, and from that moment on, all the slaves are freed, all debts are canceled, right? So that's just the things that I mentioned last week that I don't want to go back into with detail, but we should recall as we move from Moses Hess, from Sirkin to Moses Hess, because that's what we're doing now. We're going to now talk about Moses Hess's understanding of the Sabbath. And I think the thing that needs to be said before we actually start with Hess is we'll get an answer today as to where Nachman Sirkin, who we learned last week, got his idea and even the term Sabbath of history, right? Just to make a long story short, we saw it last week with Sirkin. We'll see it again this week with Hess. If we talk about the Jubilee year, let's say, after the previous 2 cycles of the weekly Sabbath and the 7-year cycle Sabbath, and we get to the 49, actually the 50th year of the Jubilee, Sirkin referred to that almost in the context of the prophetic spirit in which the Jubilee year, again, symbolizes the end of time, symbolizes the end of history. It also symbolizes the ideals of redemption, which in the prophets are mainly social ideals, right? So Sirkin talks about both the Messianic period and the way it's symbolized in the Jubilee year as the Sabbath of history. Meaning what? Not only that after every 6 days, everybody gets to rest, but even that is a small symbol of what's expected according to the prophets when we've actually become deserving of a redemption in a Messianic period, which is that, in a sense, all people rest, right? It's in that way, the resting is still a memory of creation at the end of which God rested. But at the same time, it's all people and therefore seen as an ideal. It's almost to say, when the freedoms, equalities, and ability to rest on the Sabbath becomes the lot not only of the social elite, or even the Israelite people as opposed to all others. But when it becomes in the ideal and even the realized ideal of all peoples and all people, that we can talk about that as the Sabbath of history, the same way we talk about the 7th day of the week as the weekly Sabbath. It's both the end of not one cycle, but now many cycles of time, but also the beginning of a new epoch, where society will be of a totally different structure. And this is the way that Sirkin understood it. And very similarly, we'll see it already appears in Moses Hess. Why do I say that it's Moses Hess that Sirkin took this idea from, although he expressed it differently, it's really the same idea? Well, first of all, because the idea is explicit in Moses Hess, and the idea of the Sabbath of history, right? In Moses Hess, and for Sirkin too. So what does it signify? It signifies what I just said in terms of traditional and biblical Jewish perceptions, the end of time, the realization of creation in accordance with the understanding of the prophets. But both Sirkin, but even more so, and originally it was Hess, when he was in a period of time, Moses Hess, and I'm going to talk about his biography in a moment, so you'll know you'll understand what I'm saying. There was a period of time in which he was very, very much divorced and alienated from the Jewish people, and was not interested in having anything to do with Judaism. That was the period of time that I mentioned last week, that Moses Hess was a full-fledged partner of Marx and Engels in not only developing systematic ideas of socialism, but also basically what became to be known later as communism, or Marxist socialism. But there came a point, particularly, by the way, you should know, following the establishment of a united Italy from the different city-states in what today is Italy, that impressed upon Hess the idea of a national renewal. And he took that idea and tried to think about it with regard to the Jewish people. I mean, Hess, who had been relatively assimilated, at least ideologically assimilated, he could never get away from being a rabbi's son, I would say, right? So I lost my train of thought for a moment. You'll excuse me? Anybody know? Oh yeah, so Hess, in this period of time, at the point that he's coming back to his Judaism, he starts reflecting on his own socialism, his understanding of history, and so on and so forth. But at this point, we're around 1860 now, so I just mentioned that there was, he had an appreciation of the creation of an Italian state in Italy. And even though it's not, he doesn't specify which ones, there are many new modern, actually, states, republics created at the time, and he was very impressed by that. And at the same time, there was the Damascus affair in Syria with the blood libel that, Jews, as it happened in Eastern Europe here and there, were accused of killing a Muslim child for, I don't remember the details and the reasons, and there were, what's that? It wasn't even, there was for matzah as well. Okay, and what Hess couldn't understand and made him want to go back and be a part of the Jewish people, he couldn't understand, it was actually Abraham Geiger of the Reform Judaism at the time in Germany. I couldn't understand how Geiger could say, of course, as Jews, we should, who are interested in social justice, feel for the Jews of Syria as we would feel for any human being who's attacked unjustly. But there's no special obligation on German Jews because the Syrians who are attacked happen to be Jewish. And this has to do with a change in the conception of what it means to be Jewish and the relationship between Jewish particularism and the universal humanity. Hess couldn't, not ideologically, in himself, he just rebelled against that, and at this point, I think was his appreciation of how, in his mind, nationalism can become a positive force in the world, and his disappointment with Jewish humanists concerning their relation to the Jews in Syria under attack, and probably many other things as well. I wouldn't put it past him that Marx was very critical of Hess and used to laugh at him a lot and of his Jewishness. Marx was okay. He was one generation away. But there are points where he laughs at Hess for being too committed to prophetic ideals rather than to the systematic dialectic of history and things like that. There are a lot of reasons why, but the fact is that around 1859, 1860, Moses Hess went from seeing himself as an absolutely cosmopolitan a citizen first of Germany, and then I don't know if he became a citizen of France, but still cosmopolitan, living in Paris because there was an arrest warrant out for him because of his socialist activities in Germany, and he went from that to writing a book called Rome and Jerusalem, in which he's revisiting all his ideas of history, of social justice, and adding now the ingredient of national identities or national cultures in the context of history. but he remains a modern socialist in the way that he began, in the sense that he's still, in the same way that Marx and Engels did, though, they saw history as the forum or the context, the process through which social justice is going to be achieved as the definition of a future humanity. But once again, here Hess is even more adamant in seeing this social understanding of history in the context of Jewish ideas and texts, rather than in a Western systematic philosophical thinking, the way that Marx and Engels were developing it. One thing I must say is that Hess was a former yeshiva, he wasn't actually a yeshiva student, he was taught by his father and grandfather, and he knew Jewish texts and Judaism like from the inside and the out. And he did make the decision, like many other people of his generation, that he was now cosmopolitan, he was a person of the world, and that's probably what brought him to socialism. And yet, all during this time, one thing you see with the difference between Hess and, let's say, Marx and others, including Jews who, let's say, whose parents already turned their backs on their Jewish affiliation. What's the difference? You read Marx, you can like things, and with some things Marx is brilliant and he was absolutely right about, as far as I'm concerned. There are other things that he really went too far in the way he understood the systematization, in my opinion. One thing you can criticize Marx for, you cannot criticize Marx for haphazard thinking. And a lot of things he wasn't disciplined at all, but the ideas were really well structured and worked on. You read Hess, and I feel like it's a former, sometimes like a yeshiva student who never got a college education, even though he identifies with the culture and the society that the universities are a part of. He didn't get that kind of education. His writing is very unsystematic. And in order to see what's consistent in his thinking, very often, you have to jump paragraphs. After you've read all of it, you have to really see where the continuity is. And only then can you start building a picture. Very, very undisciplined. In any event, what we're going to now see is, as we go into the later texts of Hess, right? Moses Hess. So in the later texts of Hess is how he reframes his earlier notion, a term he used even when he was alienated from the Jewish people, right? His notion of the Sabbath of history. Even when he was partner with Marx and Engels, he wrote a book about human history, and he uses the same scheme after he returns to his Judaism, but this discussion is different because now, rather than being interested in human history as though it's one general piece, like on a canvas, without any distinctions with it, with his return to Judaism, he's beginning to understand human history as the product of particular national histories, and which makes him change his course let's say, distances him slightly from the different socialist movements and organizations that he was familiar with in his time. In what way? Because now Hess believes that it's the job of every particular nation state, right? This is the period of creation of nation states in the modern period. So every particular nation state, or that the society of every nation state, has to work either for the revolution or for the evolution that'll bring about social justice in their state, in their people, and then in the end of time, if that works, then we'll have a redeemed humanity for everybody, or Marx would say we'll have the dictatorship of the proletariat, or however we want to put it. So what I want to do now is just mention as quickly as possible how he used the term a Sabbath of history in his earlier work. Then we're going to, while we're doing that, we're going to take a look at two texts from the prophets, Jeremiah and Hosea. And the reason we're going to do that is because in the text of his earlier period, before he returned to Judaism, he left Judaism, but he wouldn't leave the prophets. He made the prophets, and the prophets were the prophets of Judaism and of Christianity, So he made the prophets an integral part of his historical scheme. How did he do it? By using the term divine knowledge. Divine knowledge, we'll see for him, is equal to what it was for the prophets. Take a look for a second at the text in front of you. Let's see how the term divine knowledge, and I'll tell you right away, since in Hebrew, the term used by the prophets in one or another grammatical form would be da'at Elohim, right? That can be translated in English either as knowledge of God or divine knowledge. And as we know, divine knowledge is somewhat elastic. It can mean either human knowledge of God, right? Or it can mean God's own knowledge, could be divine knowledge. And I think that in Hebrew, those two possibilities are there. But just take a look at the first text from Jeremiah, right? Here's Jeremiah says, "Thus said the Lord, the wise person should not take praise for his wisdom, nor the powerful for his power, or the rich person for his wealth. Rather, in this should one be praised, in becoming enlightened, in following me." Now, what does that mean? I'm sorry, I blew it. Becoming enlightened in knowing me. That's where he doesn't say da'at Elohim, divine knowledge. It's a different grammatical form. You should take praise only in knowing me. But what's knowing me? "For I am the Lord who does mercy, maintains the law, and does justice." And it's clear that here in Jeremiah, the divine knowledge has to do at least with the knowledge, the prophetic position, right? The knowledge that God is interested in mercy and justice, right? As the ethical God. That's the same thing. It's not a coincidence that in the prophet Hosea, he quotes God as saying, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and knowledge of God," or divine knowledge, rather than burnt offerings, right? The reason we went into these texts, because I think without knowing them, it's hard to know what Hess means already in his early writings, but also in his later writings when he uses the term knowledge of God, which he does with regard to the social trajectory of history, right? He thinks that when all people in the world have this knowledge, right? Then that because of the change in human consciousness, history will necessarily be on the right track to the redemption of mankind through justice, right? And he works this into his concept of history. So let me see if we can now go right to the other text. I said that eventually, here's the point. So I do think I need to say just a little bit more about his concept of history in order to fill the picture, and then we can go into the text. So I would put it this way. As opposed to Karl Marx, who believes that the progress of history is dependent upon a somewhat already determined dialectic that works out logically through the material history of humanity. I started with Marx. What does that mean for Marx? What that means is every society will always wind up with some kind of conflict between the interests of those who have power, those who have material wealth, right? And those who aren't and are subservient. Eventually, that conflict becomes so strong that it becomes a revolutionary moment in society. And that already, for Marx, kind of brings the seeds of the move to the next period of historical development. And that's how this is very, very simplistic what I'm saying, but it's all we need here. It's this logic of material, the material logic of history that brings about human progress and the progress of history. So it's determined. People don't really make choices. People are forced into their responses. If it's to get my interest, then I'm going to respond. What does Hess do? Hess says, no, it's dependent upon choice. It's the kind of choice you can only make after you have before you the ideal that you're obligated to and want to work for. So he set up the prophets' understanding of the future redemption as the goal of history, and then every generation is challenged to develop the understanding of divine knowledge the way the prophets used it, and then that knowledge will change the course of history. That's the difference between the two of them. So I think that's enough of an understanding in order to go to the text. Maybe you should know, just for the good of it, when he talks about divine knowledge, he's talking about, he very often uses the term, he calls the prophets the teachers of humanity. And then there have been a very small number of individuals in the history of the world who continued the prophet's career, the prophet's mission in terms of the teachers of humanity. The first individual that followed the prophets was Jesus. In his earlier period, he emphasizes this, right? But he also had a criticism of Jesus and Christianity because he said their answer to the call of the prophets was, or Jesus' answer, according to Hess, and here's where he's shaky. Yeah, he makes no distinction between how history or consciousness later on understood Jesus and the historical text. But in any event, he's saying the problem is that Jesus, that's the way he puts it, taught that we have to leave material reality in order to achieve the divine knowledge of the prophets. And Hess says, but ultimately that won't fix history. That will train a part of humanity to have the right values, but not how to struggle for them in reality, because it's turning your backs on what belongs to the Caesar, right? To turning your backs on what belongs to Caesar in order to, you do what you have to do with Caesar, but the real thing is with God. And the other person he thought was a teacher that continued the mission of the prophets was Spinoza. And there's no need to go into that because there's no way he could have thought this without pushing onto Spinoza a lot of things that Spinoza would never have agreed with. And it's more how Spinoza was accepted later on in history by a lot of Jewish enlighteners. Okay, so those are the two. But now Hess believes that since he's now talking, right, we're talking the first half and then his return to Judaism is around 1860. So we're talking about the first half and the middle of the 19th century. And since this is the time in which modern humanism is really becoming, at least in the West, a world phenomena, it's beyond the ideologies of the Enlightenment elite of the 18th century, Hess is calling this the beginning of the last stage of history before the ultimate redemption, right? And once again, this is what brings us back to our topic. All of this is placed underneath the category of the Sabbath of history, the way of identifying the future redemption that the prophets prophesied with the Sabbath of history when justice will reign for all, just as it's depicted in the different cycles of Sabbath that we mentioned earlier. Okay, so with that, let's go to the texts that we have here. And here we go. So we did the two of the prophets. The first text that I brought, I already told you that Hess has a problem with writing. The book, by the way, is written as in a model of letters, a fictitious addressee that he's writing back and forth to. He didn't have the ability to build a structured discussion or argument. So he's saying what he would say like in a conversation with another person and doesn't have to give that type of lecture, we'll say. So I'm looking for the text where he mentions the Sabbath, particularly the Sabbath of history. And the first one is where he ties together the prophetic notion of knowledge of God or divine knowledge, right? Being a knowledge of divine ethics, you can call, the Jewish Sabbath, and what he calls the ethical history of humanity. And what does he say in the text? The great teachers of the knowledge of God were Jews. This is why I had to give you this little introduction a couple of minutes ago. And he's not saying that as a chauvinistic kind of thing, or that may be an element there, but he's referring to Jesus and Spinoza. And he thinks because of the prophetic heritage, it's not a coincidence that people like these became the teachers of humanity. That's the way Hess understands it. Then he continues and says, the mission, meaning the mission of the prophets, will remain with the Jew, as the teachers of humanity, will remain with the Jews until the end of days. That is, until the time when, according to the promise of our prophets, the world will be filled with knowledge of God. Parentheses, just know that the way he enunciated here is identical to what Maimonides says, although Maimonides has more of an emphasis on divine providence as well, where Maimonides says, the messianic period will not come about because some very gifted king or leader or God or anybody else is going to do miracles or do like incredible things that we can't believe to bring in a different age in which everything will be miraculous and godly in a magical or unnatural way, but rather society will have changed and divine truth, this is Maimonides' statement, will be in the hearts of the human beings so that authoritarian governments will no longer be necessary. As though the truth and what he thinks the Torah is going for will already be an integrated part of human culture, and that will be the messianic. He's trying to take all the unnatural stuff out of, and very close to what Hess is saying here. And then Hess continues talking about the end of days, that Judaism envisioned already at the beginning of history, right, is not to be interpreted as the end of the world, but denotes the period when the development of humanity will reach its highest point. Now, I don't know how many of you actually remember what we did with Hess, with Sirkin last week, but this is a point that Sirkin took over without any change at all, right? The end of days is the point at which humanity will reach at the end of its highest point in the future. And what we saw with Sirkin, all right, or to the end of, all right, is, one second, what was the word? Is not to be seen, right? Here Hess says it's not to be seen or interpreted at the end of the world. And so I don't know if you remember Sirkin, who made a comparison between the end of days in pagan cultures and the messianic idea in Judaism. And Sirkin also said that the difference is that it's not, Sirkin said it's not a return to an earlier point of time, just, like we know of the Olympics, it's like a return to the same point every year or every 4 years, a secular notion of time. That's the way Sirkin understood the notion of history in Greek culture, in ancient Hellenic culture, right? And here now we have Hess doing the same thing, right? Except that Hess isn't talking about the secular understanding of time the way that Sirkin did, that he's opposing, but Hess is opposing the idea of the end of days being a mythical concept that has no real ethical value. It's not the end of days and that's it. It's the time when humanity will be perfected, right? So it becomes an ideal of history and in this sense becomes a challenge of history. And then he continues, we are on the eve of the Sabbath of history. He's so impressed with modern humanism, which probably had a lot to do with the reasons why earlier on he left Judaism and joined people like Marx and Engels, right? Because this is modern humanism. This something great happened that didn't happen all through the years. Freedom has become a value. Equality and justice have become social values that are more important than the old hierarchies, if you want to call it that. So we are on the eve. It's not yet the Sabbath of history. There's real progress here. but it's not yet the Sabbath itself. We're at the eve of the Sabbath. We're on Friday. It's not yet Saturday, right? We're on the eve of the Sabbath of history and should prepare for our last mission. Now he's talking into Jews through an understanding of our historical religion. And now if you look down, you see this is already from his book, Rome and Jerusalem, this is why he's no longer writing to humanity in general. In this book, he's taking his ideas and trying to combine them with the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland and have the Jewish people further the socialist ideal in that way. Take a look at the next text. And here, if the previous text was knowledge of God, the Jewish Sabbath, and the ethical history of humanity, so the next text deals with the concept of time that I just mentioned. You know what? I have to tell you something. I think a moment ago, my mind does this often, I may have turned around Hess and Sirkin. It doesn't matter. The point is going to be explicit in the next text where he says, being and becoming as the difference between Jewish and Hellenic culture. And it coincides with what I said before. Why in Hellenic culture, according to Hess, is being is at the center. You could see the concept of form in Plato, which is in many ways has already been influenced by the aesthetics in the parts of Greek culture that influenced Plato. You can see very much in Plato how and I'm not expecting anybody here to be an expert in Plato, but there's a correspondence between mythical idea of the gods and Plato's idea of the good. It's everything. It's almost like all of a visual picture, and there's a clear hierarchy, right? We don't have to go into that. The point is that philosophy that starts in Hellenic culture may have actually taken the shape it did in the West because of the transition from earlier mythology to reason thinking. It could be that culturally, this consciousness or this mind was already trained to see things, in a way that has a heaven, a sky where the gods are acting, and a middle, right, where the humans live, and beneath them, of course, is the earth. But once you have that as an image of reality, it's an image that stands in itself. And now you're going to ask, but how does reality really work? And you have Plato who arrives at the conclusion that everything has a form that is beyond all materiality. And I know this is a table because there's a form of a table. The form of a table is that it can be used to put things on. It's an idea. And you can't do that unless it has a surface and 3 legs or whatever, a base. I'm looking at this table, right? But the form is the reality. The materiality is just the expression. The form is the being, right? When Aristotle talks that everything has an essence, right? Human beings are rational, actually, or social animals. That's the essence of human being. No questions are being asked here concerning process or development. And therefore, Hess says, the Greeks sanctified and worshiped nature in its finished and harmonious form. The finished and harmonious form is the human being, right? I'm sorry, the human being also has been deified in the Hellenic world as a complete organism, but not what? But not as a moral and social being. When Greek philosophy asks the question, what is the nature of being human? It analyzes very often the empirical human being. Even Plato, who comes to the conclusion that, well, the way we would use the term essence, right? The essence of being human is, let's say, the reasonableness that distinguishes humanity from other creatures. In any event, it's derived from that abstract form. Once again, the concept of being, right? In Judaism, he says, exists exactly what Greek philosophy wasn't interested in, understanding of the human being as a moral and social being. Why? Because Hess is going to say, where is this moral and social being? In the process of his development. He says that the Bible and Judaism, he means Christianity in the end, he means all of the traditions that come from biblical monotheism, right? Understand the human being in the process of his development and the goal, let's say, according to which in biblical tradition, he's going to be judged, right? It's the human being in his process of becoming human that humanity is understood in the Bible according to Hess, as opposed to an understanding of the human being as already being human. Being human for Hess means you have to become human, which is why history is an essential element to his understanding of social justice. It's not something that humanities are born with or that exists in human society at any given moment. It's something that develops in time as a characteristic of the human beings who create and run their society. And there is progress in history according to Hess, the way there's progress in history according to Marx and Engels. So then he continues and says, it's like, so that, well, Greek culture did not consider the human being primarily as a moral and social being, but even ethics is derived from the concept of being with regard to human being. And in the Bible, what Hellenic culture doesn't do is understanding human as a moral and social being in the process of his development, as is the case of Christianity and its historical precedent, Judaism. The Jews in particular deified becoming. And notice this, sometimes he has great insights, and I hear he really convinced me, at least to an extent, because he says the Jews even deified becoming and worshiped the God whose very name, I'm gonna, after the parentheses, is tied to past, present, and future. And then somebody reading this is gonna ask, wait a second, where is God's name in the Bible or anyplace else tied to past, present, and future? Somebody who works a lot in this stuff knows the answer right away. There are different names for God, but the most holy one in English is called Jehovah. In Hebrew, the letters of the root word of that name would be Havaya, which is being, or Hoveh, which is present. So it'd be present being. But that's not the name of God. In the name of God, Jews don't like to say, or this name, the way it's written, because it's considered like an affront to the awe that you're supposed to have. But if you read the words, the letters in Hebrew, it would be Yehovah, meaning will be, right? Hoveh, he is. Who Hoveh, he be, he is now. Yehaveh, he will be. The name of God, technically in the Bible, that name, the most important name of God in the Bible, technically means will be. When at the burning bush, when Moses asks God, tell me what your name is, he says, Eheyeh asher eheyeh. I will be as I shall be. Hess's conclusion is that the biblical and therefore Jewish and Christian understandings of God is not God as absolute being the way, let's say, Western philosophy would understand God, but it's God in it's the transcendent in relation to process, in relation to progress, in relation to becoming. God himself is the God of becoming in this sense. And on this basis, he finishes the text that we're now reading, and he says, the Bible begins with the creation of the world. Listen to what he says here. The Bible begins with the creation of the world, the first words of the Bible, right? And in the beginning, God created heavens and earth. The Bible begins with the creation of the world and the declaration of the natural Sabbath. At the end of the creation story, the first creation story in the Bible, God rests, and there's the first Sabbath. Now Hess doesn't call it the weekly Sabbath. He calls it the natural Sabbath. Why does he call it the natural Sabbath? Because it's sanctifying the completion of the creation of the natural world, of the world of nature. And why is that important? Because on that basis, he can now come along and say, and immediately following the natural Sabbath, we begin with the historical one. It's not all that simple, but look at the text, it'll be very clear in a moment. So the Bible begins with the natural Sabbath, but the prophets, very parallels what we saw last week in Sirkin, but the prophets have gone further and completed the process, embracing the entire history of human development and foreseeing the historical Sabbath, almost as though the natural Sabbath, the one that everybody knows, if anybody knows anything of the Jewish Sabbath, they know that weekly, what he calls natural Sabbath, commemorating creation. But here he's saying that at least biblically, the real significance of that is that it's already alluding to the Sabbath of history that, of course, can't be mentioned at the beginning and is developed by the prophets, according to him. And he even says this explicitly in the next text, which is that the last text we have, or no, I think I have another after that. Maybe not. Let's see. So now he talks about the Sabbath as testimony to the divine law of progress. And now we're going to see how he understands the Sabbath of creation, the natural Sabbath, necessarily alluding to the historical Sabbath. So he says, this belief, what belief are we talking about? Apparently, it's talking about the belief that there will be a messianic redemption that he associates with social justice. The belief is symbolically expressed in our historical religion. Very important to say that Judaism is a historical religion, meaning for him that Judaism takes history seriously, because without that, you don't have becoming and you don't have progress. And the very fact is that particularly somebody like Hess at the historical crossroads that he was standing knows that how much of his language comes from the history of Judaism, right? It's very important. You'll see why this is really important in a moment. So the belief is symbolically expressed in our historical religion, as opposed to a historical philosophy, by the Sabbath festival. The celebration of the Sabbath is the embodiment of the great idea which has always animated us, the Jewish people, namely that the future will bring about the realization of the historical Sabbath, right? The future will bring about the realization of the historical Sabbath, just as the past gave us the natural Sabbath, so that history, like nature, will finally have her epoch of harmonious perfection. All he's done until now is set up what we might call an analogy and declare there's a connection. It's more than an analogy. The analogy would be that the natural Sabbath is the completion of the material world after the 7 days of creation, and the same thing in human life. It's the completion of the week where people work for a living, build civilization, and then rest on the Sabbath. And saying this is analogous to the historical Sabbath that has not yet come. And then in the next sentence, he says, right, as opposed to what normally what's the first thing people learn in Sunday school? You learn the story of creation of the world by God. And here comes Hess and says, the biblical story of creation is only told to teach the ideal Sabbath. It's just that if we didn't have an understanding of God, with relation to creation of the world, we could never have an understanding of what the prophets are referring to when they talk about the end of days. It tells us, what does the creation story tell us? That when the creation of the world of nature was completed with the calling of the human being into life, right? I mean, that's the last thing. And God says, let us create man. And right, and man is created, and that's the end of the creation story. So it tells us when the completion of the story it ends with the calling of the human being into life or into creation, and then the creator rested on his natural Sabbath because it's the end of the creation of nature. At that moment, there at once began the workday of history. Like until now, it was God's work. We don't have human beings. Only now do we It doesn't matter if we think it actually worked like this, but the way it's being depicted, they're like, only now is there a world. And then Hess is being note. There is no social world. There is no human civilization until the natural creation was complete. In the way it's as told in the Bible. And then he says, but then at that moment began the historical creation of the social world. They're like, Jews who observe the Sabbath, the transfer from, or the transition from the Sabbath to Sunday, in Israel at least, where it's a regular workday. Sunday's a regular workday. It's just incredible. People who observe the Sabbath, mostly staying at home. They may be going to the synagogue. It's a big family day and stuff like that. Sunday, everybody's going out to work. So he's saying it's the same thing cosmically. It's not until after God created the world and rested do we have people. What happens, even biblically, sometime between Friday and Sunday, the following Sunday, which is discussed, Adam and Eve are exiled from the Garden of Eden, according to the story. According to Hess, that's just depicting how we got to where we are, or giving some kind of symbolism to depict how we are. After God finishes creating the world and we have a natural cosmos, the human being is put in, and then the human being has to go to work in order to live, meaning that creation is not really complete yet. Only the natural creation is. Once human beings become active, we have the beginning of a new history, of a new reality, that of humanity, society, culture, and so on and so forth. So he says, then began the historical creation of the social world. Only then, only after the natural creation was complete, and this, which will celebrate its Sabbath, and the social historical world will celebrate its Sabbath only after the completion of its world historical labor. And then look at the paragraph. So God created the world in 7 days. Let's call that divine history that preceded human, or natural history that preceded society. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Now human beings start a whole new process that comes out of the first one of creation, which shows how incomplete natural creation is if we're talking about reality in general, because then human beings actually have to start working for a living. It means they have to enter into social relations with each other, and now we're talking about a social reality and not only natural reality, but we're still talking about a process, a progressive process that will be filled in the end of time. How? By introducing the Messianic epoch, right? So we have a perfect analogy. God created the natural world, rested on the seventh day. That's the end of one, we'll call it now a topograph. I don't know what the right word is. It's not a cycle. One level of reality immediately begins the next level of reality, which is the world of social history, and then the Sabbath will come. The historical Sabbath will come at the end. And then he ends this by saying, the biblical Sabbath law itself gives a sense of certainty that there is a uniform, eternal, divine law that governs natural and historical progress. And we're going to finish with this, but I want to explain this statement on the backdrop of what Moses Hess was doing in the 1850s. It was during the 1850s that Moses Hess had to go into exile from Germany and went into and spent Paris. He was there during he was already there, if I'm not mistaken, during the 1848 short-lived revolution, and he was very active in that. But during that time, that was also the time where he became estranged from Marx and Engels. And as a person of the world, knowing what the new findings are, what's going on in intellectual culture and stuff, realized that geology is an up-and-coming science, and started saying, what's being found in geology concerning the history of the world? And he understood the nature of the character of nature as an organic phenomenon. I think we already mentioned that, right? That the whole is dependent upon the relationship between the parts, and in that way, the whole is actually more than the sum of the parts, and every part interacts both with the other parts and the whole. That's the way nature works, right? he started studying geology when he was in Paris in the 1850s. And when he came back and wrote Rome and Jerusalem, he came up with the idea that all of reality, it's a difficult thing to understand. Well, like, how can you be so convinced? All of reality, both material and spiritual, moral, ethical, everything, is all of an organic nature. And so if we have human society, and science already tells us through geology, forgetting about the story of creation, but how the material world came to be, and it's an organic process. Otherwise, nature wouldn't hold together. So now Hess is reaching the conclusion that once the natural world seems complete to the extent that we can actually study it and learn its laws, and the laws actually seem to keep working, so the creation of nature does seem to be complete, he continues with the idea of organism. And so the same process of becoming that we already saw in the geological world, after human beings are filling this natural world, the same process continues afterwards, and it's a process of an organic character. But here in nature, what makes it an organic reality? The fact that the cells are tied to each other, and the sun, the water, the trunk, everything has a function that makes the whole work. That's what makes nature organic, right? Organic, let's remember, doesn't mean monolithic. It means a plurality of phenomena that become united in the relationships between them. That's what it means to talk about nature as being organic. Hess is saying the same thing about human society, except that human society, if we're talking about the plurality of human society, he sees it in the hierarchical structure of society, that there's a difference. An upper class and a lower class is different than each other. The multiplicity of religions and peoples and natures who could easily all fight each other, right? This is a pluralistic human world that can very easily fall into disarray unless the organic principle is dominant. And so now he's understanding the future messianic redemption as being the point in which humanity becomes united. Now, without going into detail, when he talks about the disunity of humanity, an empirical plurality that at the start is not necessarily unifying, but talks about the goal of progress and the result of historical progress being the unity of humanity through this historical process. He obviously sees the notion of social justice, equality, and human dignity as the unifying factor. The principles of universal humanism here are what's going to create the unity of humanity through the days. So now he feels, if we look at the sentence again, he says the biblical Sabbath law itself gives a sense of certainty that there is a uniform, eternal, divine law that governs natural and historical progress. Now, of course, anybody, me, because I was trained as a critical thinker, I look at this and says, yeah, but like somebody made up this story. What kind of certainty does it give you? It's clear, again, this is one of Hess's faults as a thinker. He doesn't know how to critique himself in an elegant way. He can get hit over the head and change his opinion. But here, the only way he can make the statement is by already presuming the hypothesis that all of reality is a matter of organic progress, the progressive unification of diverse phenomena into an organic unity. That's the way he understands the divine. He was an atheist. It's the story. We're talking about God. It's the image of God in the story. He doesn't think it happened metaphysically. But whether we're talking about the story or whether we're talking about what you can learn from geology, that we know there's a process. You might call it a progress until nature actually became what it was. You begin with a Big Bang, one molecule. I'm not an expert on this stuff. But you know that even geology didn't, natural world was not like absent and then present the way it is now, but there's an organic process. And that's what Hess expects from the future. It's a hypothesis. He has no, you could easily say, no, I don't believe that. All right, and then what is he going to say? He's going to say, the Bible tells me that? Anyway, that's pretty much Moses Hess. So I want to just say a few sentences now about Sirkin and Hess concerning the Sabbath and about, the classes that we've had all together. So first thing about Sirkin and Hess is that out of all the thinkers that we've done, they're just one example of Jews who very often biographically or autobiographically were forced to come to terms or make some kind of sense of the meeting between their own Jewishness and modern humanism. With Hess and Sirkin on the Sabbath, and the reason I chose the Sabbath is because it's just a great topic. The Sabbath is already a part of their Judaism, let's say, and the way they interpret the Sabbath demonstrates the humanistic concept that is certainly compatible with the principles of modern humanism. And this was really the Hess and later on Sirkin, if we think about the development of Jewish existence in the modern period, so there's Central Europe shortly after the Enlightenment, during the times of emancipation, a lot of assimilation, right? And then we could talk about things that went on in Eastern Europe, right? They're all different types of meetings with modern humanism in different areas. The reason I think Sirkin and Hess are so important, aside from me personally, because they were they founded, one was the foreseer of socialist Zionism, and the other one was the founder of the actual movement of social Zionism. But aside from that, I believe that if we want to see who developed a language that reflects the meeting between Judaism and modern humanism in a way that actually affected the Jewish people's place in the world for generations to come, Moses Mendelssohn did that by actually creating the form of what eventually became Jewish existence in the diaspora. Remember, Mendelssohn, when in his meeting of Judaism and Christianity, he was concerned with the problem of the status of Jews and Judaism in modern civil society. And his solution to that problem was the state needs all religions of reason for the social education of society, and for the state's good. They should know that Jews are never going to learn social values from the stories of Jesus' disciples or Easter, or right. They're going to learn it from the Passover and stories of Rabbi Akiva. And for the state interest, for social education, they should be interested in equality between Christianity and Judaism. That was Mendelssohn's position, coming out of the context he lived. Krochmal, same kind of question. He's a very traditional Torah Jew, is now being challenged by modern humanism, with secular and critical ways of understanding the Bible that contradict a lot of things the rabbis said in the past. How do you do it? So he developed his own understanding of historical progress and how the Torah or even the Bible is a part of this type of spiritual progress that can only be understood when critiqued historically. Right? So that was his meeting, coming out of a situation in which there was no emancipation. So Krochmal's meeting with modern humanism was purely intellectual, as opposed to Mendelssohn, right? Herzl and Achad Ha'am, it was theory of how Jews fit in the world, either on the backdrop of modern anti-Semitism or on the backdrop of assimilation. They both founded the two major forms of Zionism on that background. Again, the social context, the historical context is apparent with both. Herzl developed political Zionism as an assimilated Jew who could not escape anti-Semitism, looking for a solution to anti-Semitism for all Jews, and it was naturally for him going to be a political solution, establishment of the state. Achad Ha'am, an atheist, but very traditional Jew from the Pale of Settlement in the East, was really concerned. He saw how much assimilation was growing. So His confrontation with modern humanism was to show how Judaism itself can be transformed from a religion, or a religion, we'll call a somewhat fundamentalist religious culture, to a modern secular humanist culture, right? And then after all of that, we come back once again to Hess, and I'm sorry about that. We come now back to Sirkin and Hess. In all of these movements, in a way, Hess and Sirkin are a part of the movement that Achad Ha'am and Herzl started, but except that Hess came before them. And all Hess is doing, he's trying to, in Hess's period, there weren't any addresses to go to that already worked out some way of mediating between their previous Jewishness and the new modern humanism. And that's why in the early 19th century, it was the biggest period of Jews converting to Christianity or just denying their Judaism in order to be able to fulfill emancipation, and right? And Hess, in that way, originally decided, the Judaism I grew up is just not a part of the modern world. I'm going to join the aligners who really know what's going on, appreciate science, and understand the logic of social justice, because Judaism has become reactionary. What does it have to do with me anymore? I want to be a part of the world. And after trying that, realized how much was in him, that was Jewish, and was then motivated when he returned to Judaism to retranslate his meeting. His first meeting with modern humanism was to reject Judaism. And then he revisited that decision and came back to Judaism without rejecting the modern humanism, the ideas of social justice and historical progress that he had earlier, but rather reframe them in the context of his turn to the Jewish people and to Judaism now as a culture. Okay, so I think that's schematically, I think what we did over this past class, and I want to thank you all. I've had a tremendous time, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Sorry.
You have it for a living. What did he do for a living? How did he?
Good question. Do you know what Marx did for a living?
No.
Same thing. They tried whatever they can, if they can get some money for publishing pamphlets or whatever. But that was it. More than these guys were revolutionaries in their day-to-day life. Good question. I don't know the answer to that. I've read more on this point. I've read more of Marx's biography than Hess's, and he was basically supported by his followers, from what I can get. That's also actually too simplistic. But there were a lot of times in which he was supported by others.
Thanks. Anybody online or in the audience would like to comment or ask a question? I do. So.
Okay, Rick.
Thank you. So thank you for this really rousing finale to the course.
Thank you.
And linking everything together. As a compadre or the partner of Marx and Engels, how did Hess think of the alienation of labor? You notice that Sirkin talked about socialism, and there was nothing in this excerpt that used that word. But when you talk about the Jubilee year, basically it's saying what a hard thing is work and slavery. And I was wondering if that was in the back of Hess's mind when he talks about social justice.
Good. I'll put it this way, and I need to say this. I've read Hess a lot, and I've done work on Hess, but Hess is not one of the central people in my agenda. So there are a lot of things about Hess's life that I don't really know. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat just in a few words because my mind's already working and on more questions than what you asked. So let me first answer your question. Right. Repeat it if you can.
Yeah, the bottom line is that when he talks about social justice, is he talking about socialism? Is he talking about alienation of labor? And is that considered what social justice is.
He's talking about socialism the way the first generation of socialists talk about socialism. And I think, by the way, it'd be very worthwhile for the Western world to revisit and see how the first generation of European socialists talked about socialism. I'm not saying that the problem of labor became central only with Marx, but to a large extent, I'm not saying that because I don't know enough, and I don't think that could possibly be. But the first generation of socialists, you think about people like Lassalle, P.L. Hicks, the early Marx, right? It's a really humanist socialist. The later Marx, you can even question as to how humanist it is. Once everything is determined by the logic of nature, you wonder how humanist it is. But earlier on, where his emphasis is alienation, right? That's the kind of rhetoric or talk that Hess will also use when he's talking about socialism. Socialism here it's not exactly, it doesn't exactly conflate with humanism, but there's a lot more conflation between socialism and humanism. Later on, we'd have to fill in a lot of steps to actually explain why later forms of socialism may still be humanist. With that first generation, it's humanism that's responding to the inequality of society as given, that's saying that liberalism wasn't sufficient in solving the problems of humanity because liberalism doesn't take into account the starting point of human beings, doesn't take into account the hierarchical nature of existing society where those have advantages and others don't. And therefore, the material element of society has to be taken into account. And the first generation of socialists, again, this isn't my field. I got to these things because of Jewish thought and philosophy, so I don't know how accurate I am, but in terms of trajectories, the emphasis, there was a very strong emphasis on the idea of fixing humanity through historical progress in a manner that requires social planning or social initiative, right? The thinkers of that generation that I've come into contact, aside from Marx later on, I haven't seen any real systematic thought which will try to reduce the social problems to one factor. The fact that the relationship between employers and employees, people who have capital and people who don't have capital, and a whole list of things at the time of the Industrial Revolution, right, is a hierarchical relationship. That was very much understood by the thinkers that I'm familiar with from that first generation. The ones I work with haven't gotten to the point of reducing it to one specific problem. You know, it's capitalism, yes, because capitalism is a part of the present day hierarchical society, and there can't be any progress without giving some wealth to those who don't have any, right? You have to change that hierarchical relationship. But so the things that you're asking, maybe in that generation, I don't see it as Hess. In Hess, labor, I think, would come under this category of the hierarchical relationships in society. I don't know of anything more specific than that.
Just a follow-up. He basically gave a Jewish reason for pursuing social justice and socialism.
That's right.
But
that's what these guys did, actually, yeah.
Yeah, but the text that you gave us, he even admitted that a lot of what he was talking about was just symbolic, a metaphor,
right.
And that it was something that is based on Jewish tradition, but wasn't necessarily reality.
Yes, but nonetheless, when we put it like that, we still might miss something very important. See, what I said was that for Hess as an atheist, both the ethical challenge, ethical obligation, and historical progress have nothing to do with metaphysics. It's not that there's a God up there who decided this is going to be the course of history, and there isn't even any necessarily intrinsic historical law that's rooted in a transcendent realm. What there is for Hess is a belief. This I haven't talked about because it wasn't, we could have gone in another 100 directions. But let's remember, we're talking about the first half of the 19th century. Think about thinkers around the turn of the 19th century who are asking questions about the Bible and even asking questions, what was the first language of humanity? And some want to say it was Hebrew or something. Others say, well, no, there were many languages, not one. There's an intuition here, which I think bears some looking into, that great literature, and given the Western world being, at that time, being primarily a Christian civilization, the Bible as great literature includes truths, even if I don't know how to systematically ground them in some transcendent reality. He has a certain appreciation of the Bible that nonetheless makes it more than symbolic. So the story is symbolic. Let's say the story of creation, it may be symbolic of what he, when he studied geology, thought happened in the coming to be of nature before it was there as it is, right? But he sees it, but it's a truth that he thinks is essential to human existence. It's not metaphysically rooted the way the Bible would say, but it's nonetheless a truth, maybe a historical truth, an anthropological truth. I don't know I don't know how to describe it, but it's not just symbolic.
Any other questions or comments? Well, let's thank Professor Turner for
Thank you very much.
Course.
I appreciate it. I hope to see you guys again sometime. Hopefully I'll be back. Thank you.